We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back for the final segment of this week's Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm still your host, Mark Angelides, and we're still with Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst. Thanks for sticking around, Tim. I know it's been a long session for us, but I think quite valuable and quite fun. So I posited the question in the end of the last segment, Tim. What were the Republican voters who returned Donald Trump to office for a second time? What were they actually voting for? And I think possibly the most important data point for that question is some recent polling by Napolitan, the Napolitan News Service, which is a fantastic place for polling. And what they found was that these are some fascinating numbers, is that 61% of Republican-leaning voters say that self-identify as Trump Republicans, while now only 27% say that they're Reagan Republicans. And even those who were, here's an interesting fact, even those that were around to remember the Reagan era, 54% of those ones consider themselves Trump Republicans. So I guess, I mean, maybe I've answered my own question here, but they were voted, the voters in 2024, they were voting for MAGA, not for whatever the traditional Republican Party really is nowadays. Even though, as we've discussed earlier, the neoconservative wing has been, I guess it's out. It's no longer a part of the present day GOP. So these are now MAGA voters. Does that make sense? It's not Republican voters anymore. It's MAGA voters.
Well, I think the thing that might have put it over the top in terms of people supporting Trump for his agenda rather than just the concept of sort of breaking the furniture and shaking things up in Washington, which is, I think, largely what they wanted the first time. Met a number of people after the 2016 election who were traditionally kind of left-leaning or actual Democrats who said they voted for Trump just to shake things up, having no idea that he could actually win because nobody thought he could except a small group of people here and there who sort of were wishing upon a star, at least initially. But I think the biggest difference between so-called Reagan Republicans and so-called MAGA Republicans or Trump Republicans is that Ronald Reagan was a true ideologue. He had a North Star of belief that he tried to basically apply to every situation in his presidency. He came in and tried to apply those principles wherever he could, whereas Trump is more of a transactional president. Now, he does have the America First philosophy, and how that sort of contrasts with Reagan is that it's really more populist than it is conservative. It incorporates conservatism into it. But for example, conservatives would never, traditional conservatives, Reagan conservatives would never support tariffs as a means to protect jobs in the United States. Trump and Reagan, what they share in common is, of course, a commanding personality in very different ways. You know, Reagan was old-fashioned. Trump is not old-fashioned, but he's a transactional politician in the sense that he sees a problem and tries to fix it best he knows how. Whereas Reagan more came in and said, I've got an agenda to apply these principles sort of across the entirety of his administration. So you can see, I mean, all of Reagan's appointees to his cabinet and agency heads were longtime conservatives, whereas you see with Trump that he has, his appointments really are across the board. For example, he's got a pro-labor Secretary of Labor. She's a Republican, but she's a liberal Republican who has a very good relationship with labor. Ronald Reagan would never have done that. But I think that, what Trump has done is in dominating the party for the last 10 years, he has turned people in his direction to a point where he owns the party. And when you own a party, there's nobody that comes close to him in terms of power in the Republican Party. When you own a party, most of the people who voted for you are going to identify with your agenda rather than the agenda of someone who was president 40 years ago.
That's fascinating. I want to come back on something you said about Reagan there and how he was a genuine ideologue. And there was a consistency with Ronald Reagan as well. And the first thought that popped into my mind there was, I'm trying to think the year, 1964. It was we call it a time of choosing speech now, but he just called it the speech. And he was stumping for Barry Goldwater.
Yes.
And if you look through that speech, that is completely consistent for 1964, what he was saying in 1984. There's very little change there. And you're right, he had a compass and that was it, and that's what he followed. And then, of course, I'd like to also reference a point you said about how Trump is not an old-fashioned conservative, which is so strange because he's a very old president. Yeah, he's a very old president.
True. It's true. Well, he's a guy that knew how to play the game of politics from early on. Let's not forget that he built his reputation as a real estate mogul in Manhattan, which is probably the most liberal borough in the entire country. So he had to play ball.
92% Democrat, yeah.
He had to play balls. So he set himself up as being pro-choice, being a Democrat, because that was the only way he could do business and earn the favor of the almost universally Democratic politicians at the time. But when he entered the national political stage, he came in as a Republican, although I would argue he was really more of an independent because he didn't just toe the party line. I mean, when he came in, Trump, in 2016, and just shocked everyone by going into the South Carolina primary, South Carolina being a very defense-friendly state, and the military, a state that is heavily associated with the military, he attacked.
And dependent on Defense Department dollars, yes.
That's right. And he attacked George W. Bush for the Iraq War, and people were stunned. And I, among others, thought that really might have been the end of him. But instead, he won that primary and moved forward from there all the way to the presidency. So he's more of a transactional figure in the sense that he sees a problem, tries to fix it. The problem that Trump has that Reagan didn't is that populism is by its nature a fleeting ideology because popular sentiment changes. So the question is, if people suddenly were opposed to a border wall, to pick one example, would he no longer want to build it? I think he would. But if people came out, if they're in favor of tariffs now, what if they aren't in 8 years? Would a MAGA Republican then favor tariffs? Whereas Reagan had a fixed, consistent ideology that really wasn't going to waver one way or the other. With Trump, he's a far more flexible politician. What they both have in common, of course, more than anything else, is strength. And that's what the two have in common. The Reagan Republicans that aren't never Trumpers and the Trump Republicans have far more in common than they have differences.
Yes, I think this strength position, it's because you don't actually see that very often in politics. You see a lot of pretend strength, people talking about how we're going to be determined, we're going to fight. But you very rarely see actual strength of character, the strength to sort of weather the political storm, regardless of what's being thrown at you. And both Reagan and Trump definitely have that. And I wonder, do you think J.D. Vance has that same strength to carry the party forward after 2028?
I don't think he does yet. He could grow into it. He's a young man. Let's remember that Trump was already, approaching 70 years old when he first ran for office. So Vance will have to grow in the position. And it's very hard to follow a guy like Trump, just like it was very hard to follow a guy like Reagan, and George H.W. Bush had a lot of trouble trying to do it.
Yeah, he found that out to his dismay. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for spending the day with us.
A lot of fun, Mark. I appreciate it.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guest today, Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in each and every week. We do appreciate you. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse campaigns, candidates, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.